We have Elyse Dobney, the program manager from the Salvation Army Stop It program, here with us today. Thank you, Elyse, for coming. Elyse, tell us a little bit about trafficking. What is trafficking? What are the differences between sex trafficking and labor trafficking, first off?
So quite frankly, human trafficking is modern-day slavery. It's when someone is forced, tricked, or threatened to perform an act of service, whether that's an act of labor or a commercial sex act. And so the primary differences between the two are just that, the actual purpose for the exploitation, right? So someone is either used for work, whether that be in a legitimate legal environment, such as a restaurant or a hotel, or more illegitimate forms, selling drugs and things of that nature. And sex trafficking is when someone is forced, tricked, or threatened to engage in the commercial sex industry. The other primary difference between sex and labor trafficking is the location where it takes place, obviously. Sex trafficking takes place kind of in the stereotypical environment, like the street level prostitution, but also we're seeing a huge increase in sex trafficking taking place using the internet and using hotels. Labor trafficking we're finding pretty much in any hospitality industry environment, so hotels, restaurants, also in agricultural environments, farms, things of that nature, and then in individual homes, so domestic servitude. And I think the challenge with labor trafficking is it looks like legitimate forms of service. How do you know that the maid or nanny next door is being trafficked versus a legitimate maid or nanny? And so it just gets tricky for people to identify labor trafficking in particular because it does look like legitimate work oftentimes.
Okay, and you mentioned that there's a difference between location for sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but is there a difference where, in terms of cities or towns, where these types of trafficking actually occur?
From our experience in the Stop It program, we tend to find trafficking, both for sex and labor, pretty much wherever we look. Obviously, it looks different depending on the environment, so a more rural environment, you would find more agricultural trafficking or something of that nature, versus an urban environment where you find it more in the hospitality industries and in local restaurants and things of that nature.
Okay, and in terms of trafficking for children, is there a difference, or can you explain the difference between children being trafficked for sex purposes versus labor purposes?
Yeah, so for youth to be considered, and minors in particular, to be considered victims of labor trafficking, they have to have been forced, tricked, or threatened into that situation. So something physically done or threats made against them or tricking them into it. When you're talking about minors in the state of Illinois and also under federal law, we believe that minors are not able to consent to engage in commercial sex, and so anyone under the age of 18 who's involved in the commercial sex industry is automatically considered a victim of sex trafficking in Illinois. And that is people who overtly have a trafficker, a pimp, but also youth who have to engage in survival sex. So someone who's trading a place to sleep for food to eat or for clothes, something of that nature, would be considered a victim of trafficking because they're still an adult who's exploiting the vulnerabilities of that minor.
Okay. And for your program, what kind of services do you offer, does Stop It offer to these victims of trafficking?
So Stop It is a local Northern Illinois initiative against human trafficking. We provide intensive case management for anyone who's trafficked who lives in Cook County or the 9 collar counties. So we work with adults and minors, with foreign national and domestic victims, and with male, female, and trans folks, and we also work with both people who've been trafficked for sex and for labor. We work with people while they're actively being trafficked to build relationship and trust so that when they're ready to exit their situation, they have someone that they can turn to and that they trust to help provide for a safe exit. And then once they've left their trafficking situation, we try to find all of the community resources necessary to build an independent life. And that's an independent life not only from their trafficker, but also from our program. So that's everything from concrete services, needing food, clothing, stuff to survive, but also a lot of resource connections, so finding housing and finding legal assistance, counseling, medical services, even tattoo cover-up. I think the important thing about our program is that we're a client-centered program, so we meet our participants where they are. We don't have a list of things that they have to do in order to engage in our services. We really want to start where they are and identify services and resources that they're interested in accessing. We don't want to replace one controller with another, where they go from having a trafficker who says you have to do X, Y, and Z, and if you don't do these things, you'll be punished, to a service provider who says you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to engage in our services, and if you don't, you're kicked out of our program or there are other consequences. So we feel very strongly that we have to be a client-centered program to meet the needs of our participants.
Absolutely.
The other thing that Stop It does that's pretty exciting and somewhat unique is we have a drop-in space for female-identified youth who have been engaged in the sex industry. And so that's specifically targeting people who've been trafficked, but not labeling it as trafficking, really reaching out to youth who would identify as engaging in survival sex or doing what they have to survive, but not identifying as a victim of anything. And that's a really important place where they can come and receive. There's always a hot meal. There's bus passes so they can get to and from our drop-in space. There are resources. We have people who can help with resumes and job searches, finding some high school resources, GED programs, things of that nature, but there's also a couch where they can take a nap or a shower where they can bathe, some things where they can just be youth and not have to think about the stresses of life for a bit.
So if someone were to want to get in contact with your program to find those resources and to have help, how would they go about doing that?
The best way to reach the Stop It program is by calling our 24-hour hotline. So we have a hotline, the number is 877-606-3158. And that's available to anyone who has been trafficked, but also anyone who's looking for community resources. If someone thinks that they've encountered someone who's been trafficked, they're free to call us and provide that information. Also for community members who think they see something suspicious and want to pass it along to law enforcement, but don't really know how to go about doing that, we have a lot of great connections with law enforcement. And so they can pass the tip through us, and we have some direct connections to people who work on trafficking cases throughout Northern Illinois.
Elyse, you mentioned labor trafficking as a concern. Can you explain a little bit more about labor trafficking and how you can have trafficking with an employee and employer relationship?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of individuals who've been trafficked for labor in the Chicago area. Most of them are foreign national victims, some of whom do not have documentation. Others have come over on a temporary work visa. And typically what we're seeing in terms of labor trafficking, kind of two different paths of entry. So the person who comes over who's undocumented oftentimes comes over through the use of a coyote, someone who smuggles them across the border intentionally. And I think that's an important thing to note is people can be smuggled into the United States. There can be laws broken. That doesn't mean that they deserve to be trafficked. In the United States, we believe that everyone has value because they're humans and they're not to be treated as a commodity that can be bought or sold. And so we have laws that protect individuals regardless of documentation when they're here in the States. So anyway, they are brought into the United States without proper documentation, and when they arrive, they're often set up in an environment where they owe money either to the coyote or whoever their employer is once they've come to the States. And oftentimes their undocumented status is used against them as a method of coercion to keep them in their trafficking situation. So someone will say, you can go ahead and leave, but I'm just going to report you to immigration, or I'm going to report you to the cops. You don't have any rights here because you're not documented, and so you can't get assistance. And oftentimes we also see, in addition to those threats made against family members in their home country. So they'll say, and if you leave, I'll go after your children or your mom or whoever that person finds important in their lives. And so that's often enough to keep people in that environment. Typically those cases we find more in a domestic servitude situation in individual homes, as opposed to kind of the larger scale hospitality industry. In the hospitality industry, what we often find are people who've been brought over on work visas. Everything seems legitimate. They've signed work contracts. This is what's expected. This is the money that you can anticipate earning that can be sent home to support your family. However, when they arrive, the contract is not honored in that method, right? And unfortunately, the way that the system works, companies can use the work visa to threaten people as well, because if you no longer work for that company, technically your visa expires, right? And so you can be deported, I guess technically is the way it would work. And so companies will say you have to do these things or we'll send you home. And so typically in the hospitality industry, it's not necessarily the big hotels that are doing the exploiting. They're contracting with other companies who bring in cleaning services, and that's where the trafficking is taking place, are those contracted agencies, not in the mainstream hotel industry or hospitality industry.
Interesting, and also I imagine too, for those that are being trafficked for labor, if they come over legally through a service or whoever brings them over, there may be threats that their paperwork will be withheld if they don't follow the instructions of the traffic.
Absolutely, and we very commonly see documentation being taken away. So someone does have some identifying information, or they have their visa, and that's confiscated by their employer or by whoever is holding them in their place of work or in their home. And that's a really effective method of control, because I don't know if you've ever had your wallet stolen. It's really hard to navigate the system, even if you're a U.S. citizen who kind of knows where to go and who to talk to. And so if you add a language barrier, you add not having your identifying documentation and being afraid that someone's going to think you're undocumented, that would be a very powerful method of keeping someone away from kind of the larger society, the larger community.
What are some ways that we can reach these individuals that are being trafficked, whether it's through labor or sexual trafficking? How can we reach out to them as a community?
So I think one of the important things to do, or I should say to not do, is if you think trafficking is taking place, please don't just reach out directly to someone who you suspect is being trafficked, especially if it's someone who you think is being trafficked for sex and you see them on the street. It's not safe to bring someone who is potentially being exploited into your car, to your home, to your place of employment. Very well-intentioned individuals have ended up in really unsafe environments, and unsafe for the victim as well, right? Because if you don't have the resources, if we don't have any beds available in Chicago that night and someone has to return to their trafficker and they haven't made enough money, the punishment for that can be quite severe. And so our recommendation would be, obviously, if there's an emergency, 911 is the only option, right? If you see someone who's being immediately threatened, you're concerned about their safety, 911 is the go-to. But there are a lot of great people who are doing investigations on trafficking locally. And so, as I mentioned earlier, if someone wants to call our hotline and provide a tip, that would be a really useful way of making sure that law enforcement is aware of a suspicious situation. I think something that would be of value for all of us is to just pay attention in the community. Oftentimes we see something that is suspicious and we have that gut reaction that something isn't right, but I think sometimes we're afraid to recognize that something actually isn't right. We just push that reaction down and ignore that we have an instinctual reaction to something that's taking place. And so I think just paying attention to those instincts, paying attention to our surroundings, and taking responsibility. Once we've heard that trafficking is taking place, we have to actually do something to combat it, right? And so whether that's actually actively getting involved in a program like Stop It or someone else, some other organization, or that could be just talking about it with your friends and with your sphere of influence. The more people are aware of trafficking, the more likely it is that we can make a big impact in terms of combating it. I think it's amazing. I've been working for Stop It for 8.5 years now, and I still consistently hear people say, I didn't know it happened here. I knew it was happening overseas. I knew it was happening in Eastern Europe or in Asia, but I didn't know it was happening here. And I think that's the scary thing, is it's right under our noses, but so many people are just unaware. And so the more we talk about it, the more awareness we raise, the bigger impact we can make in terms of combating it.
Absolutely. And Stop It has volunteer programs. Can you speak about those and about mentoring as well?
Yeah. So currently our direct service opportunities are available to female identified volunteers. We have a few options. We have our hotline, which is operated 24/7 by employees and by volunteers. And so if people are interested, they can provide support through our hotline. As I mentioned earlier, we also have our drop-in space where we like to have a few volunteers present to provide ongoing support to our participants. And our third option for direct service is in terms of mentoring, so more of a one-on-one relationship with some of our participants, because we want our participants to be engaged in the community, especially once they've graduated from our program, right? Once they've moved on, we don't want to remove all of their support. One of the important roles that Stop It trafficking specialists play is providing a lot of emotional support to our participants. But if our participants are relying solely on their trafficking specialist, what happens when their case is actually ready to be closed and they are very independent, but they're still relying on that one individual for emotional support? And because of that, we really need to develop more mentoring relationships with our participants, so we can provide that ongoing support that is so vital to establish healthy relationships in the community.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Elyse. It's a pleasure having you here.
My pleasure. Thank you.